Good evening, everyone. So, we're here for a talk to be delivered by Carrie Summers, and the title is Weaving Solutions, Addressing Fibre and Dye Challenges Through Nature and Innovation. So, I'm welcoming you to this evening's Global Challenges lecture. It's from the Institute of Liberal Arts and Sciences here at Keele. And for those who don't know about ILAS, it promotes interdisciplinary study and education and research here at Keele and beyond. And you can find more information on the ILAS website, and you can also find videos of all of our previous talks and in, 5 or 6 days' time, this talk as well, if you'd like to share it with a friend. So it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Carrie Summers. Carrie is a force for good in the global fashion industry. She is a long-time advocate and serial entrepreneur, and she's also a colleague, a friend, and a collaborator in my own research. So I'm really privileged to work with her very closely. And she is a phenomenal source of information, innovation, and networks in the space of sustainable fashion and textiles. So Carrie has created an incredible amount of change throughout her career. She's globally recognized for her fair trade work. She's an activist, a speaker, and a writer. Her career in this area began in the early 1990s when she had a summer holiday project which grew into the world's first fair trade certified company, Pachacuti, which is operating in Leek, online, and through a new store in Totnes in Devon. She then founded Fashion Revolution, which is the world's largest fashion activism movement. And she's been absolutely instrumental through Fashion Revolution in pressuring industry to become more transparent and take responsibility for its social and environmental impacts. In 2022, she moved on to basically bring her fashion activism together with her interest in fair trade and artisanal production to focus on artisans. And she founded a community interest company called League of Artisans. They're a non-profit that promotes artisanal skills as a response to the global sustainability crisis. So that's climate and biodiversity and equity in trade. So along the way, Carrie has been involved in a fair bit of academic research. She was a key member of Expedition, which was a sailing voyage that went from the Galapagos to Easter Island, and she was on that leg investigating microplastics and toxic chemicals in the Pacific Ocean. She's also collaborated on a show garden for the RHS Chelsea Flower Show, which will be familiar to some of you. She's one of the key influencers shaping the global fashion industry in the sustainability area. Her MA is in Native American Studies, and she has an honorary doctorate to replace the one that she gave up to become an entrepreneur and advocate, and that's from us at Keele. And most recently, she's held an independent Churchill Fellowship to undertake a study of natural dyes and naturally colored cotton in Latin America. Based on that work, she's currently writing a book on the history of plant fibers and dyes. So that's a bit of an introduction to Carrie, and she will be happy to take questions at the end of her talk. And for those watching online, you'll have a chance to engage in our Q&A through the portal on the right-hand side of the screen. So our online audience, a warm welcome to you, and please feel free to give us questions, and we'll endeavor to get as many of them answered as we can. After the Q&A has formally ended, we'll then move next door for more informal discussion and refreshments. So without going on any more, I'm going to hand the floor over to Carrie.
Thank you, Deirdre, and I'm delighted to be here at Keele to talk about how we can address the fibre and dye challenges in fashion and textiles. We hear a lot about them, and I do believe that nature and innovation will combine to create some solutions. But some of you might already be wondering, does fashion really matter in the grand scheme of global challenges? And when I look at past lectures, we've talked about feeding global populations, biodiversity loss, the climate crisis, and fashion might seem perhaps a little trivial to some of you amid the critical concerns of the day. Even that oft bandied around statistic, I actually saw it online this morning, again, that fashion represents 10% of global climate emissions, global carbon emissions, is actually incorrect. A recent study put it between about 2 and 5% for clothing and footwear, excluding textiles. So why are the fibres and dyes we use in fashion and textiles a global challenge? Well, it's because fashion is so deeply interconnected with so many of these critical issues, from water use and pollution through to deforestation, microfibres, and the toxic chemicals that make their way into our environment and into our bodies as well. And addressing these challenges requires more than isolated effort. It really demands collaboration and innovation across different disciplines. I live here in the Staffordshire Moorlands, and I would never have imagined that the work I carried out with Deirdre on a chilly April morning on Rudyard Lake would set me off on such a fascinating journey of exploration, really taking me into the research I'm doing today. And that's part of the reason I'm really delighted to be here as well, discussing fashion in a space that values interdisciplinary solutions. So, where do our clothes come from? Have you ever thought about the fibres and the dyes that you're wearing now? And this is just going back to Rudyard Lake. Have you thought about they might have originated in a cotton field in India or China, perhaps a herd of sheep in Australia, from wood pulp from beech, pine, bamboo or eucalyptus trees in China or Austria, or they might be derived from petrochemicals that come from an oil well somewhere in the world. And probably none of us really know where our clothes have come from unless we've spun, woven, stitched or knitted them ourselves. But the garments we're wearing are likely to have travelled through probably many different countries, through the hands of hundreds of workers before they arrive in our wardrobes. And all of our clothes tell stories, but most often those journeys they make before they reach us and after they leave our hands remain invisible to us. I spent more than 20 years working with Indigenous communities in the Andes. These are people for whom reciprocity and balance are really central to life. And my fashion brand, Patricuti, as Deirdre mentioned, I founded it in 1992. And it was supposed to be a summer holiday project in between my master's and the sailing trip and starting a fully funded PhD. But sometimes life takes us in very unexpected directions. And I started designing some knitwear, but very soon Panama hats, which the woman is wearing here, became a mainstay of the business. And Patricuti also became known as a trailblazer in an industry that was shrouded in secrecy. We were the first company in the world to be fair trade certified, and that was back in 2009. And we also participated in the groundbreaking European Union Geo-Fair Trade project. And as part of our research, we collected 70 different social, economic and environmental indicators every year, so we could really measure and know our impact on the ground with the communities with whom we worked. We also traced our Panama hats back to the GPS coordinates of each weaver's house. These are high in the Andes. Only 45% of their houses are even accessible by road. and back to the GPS coordinates of the processing facilities for the straw, and to each plot of land in the coastal cloud forest where the Coludovica palmata used to make the Panama hats is harvested on community-owned biodiverse plantations. Now, unlike most of the fibres we use for fashion today, these plants are grown without the destruction of any primary forests. In organic conditions, they require no watering or irrigation. And once a plant is established, which takes around 3 years, it can be cropped once a month for up to 100 years. So when it comes to sustainable fibres, the Panama hat really sets a very high benchmark. And as part of our research, we found that one Panama hat used the equivalent of 13 days drinking water. A cotton hat, 825 days drinking water. One Panama hat uses the equivalent energy of driving a car for 2 miles, whereas a cotton hat uses the energy of driving a car for 15 miles. And this really matters because the difference is environmentally significant, and having this knowledge helped to impact the choices that we made. All of our clothes tell really quite complex stories of global journeys and of diverse materials. And yet these stories are part of a much longer thread, going back through time. Have you ever wondered how it all began? Perhaps you have if you're an archaeologist who's been working on some of the sites where we've discovered early textiles. But long before these global supply chains of today, we began experimenting with fibres and fabrics, crafting solutions to meet our changing needs. How did our ancestors, without modern tools or technology, begin this remarkable journey of turning plants into textiles? Just imagine for a moment living during the last ice age, a time when the Earth's climate was in constant flux. Temperatures could change fast, swinging from biting cold to glacial in a matter of decades. And in this unforgiving environment, Neanderthals, our close evolutionary cousins, were engaged in a constant struggle for survival. Clad in simple hides and furs that offered little protection from the elements, they were forced to migrate south as temperatures plummeted, seeking refuge in more temperate climes. And as the advancing ice pushed them to the limits of their known world, they clung on to life in the caves of Gibraltar, seemingly with nowhere else to go. Failure to adapt to climate change has been a long-standing theory about their demise. And then archaeologists discovered something extraordinary. At Abri du Marat, which is a rock shelter on the west bank of the River Rhône in modern-day France, they found a small piece of 3-ply string, crafted from the satin-soft inner bark of a conifer and tied around a stone tool. It dates back to between 41,000 and 52,000 years ago. Now, string may seem like a simple artefact, but those flimsy fibres challenge long-held assumptions about Neanderthals' capabilities. Whoever made that first string displays a profound understanding of their environment. Hides may be good for warmth, but they're bulky and stiff and the wild wind slips in. Perhaps they observed how the outer bark of a conifer offered the tree protection against moisture loss and insulated against the harsh weather. Yet over time they realised it was the soft, fibrous inner bark made of living cells that was essential for the tree's growth and survival. Furs and hides played the role of that outer bark, yet they needed more. So did the Neanderthals set out to experiment, to imitate, learning from the layering ways of plants to increase their chances of survival? With these new fibres, they could fashion furs to fit their bodily form, protecting arms and legs, even adding layers perhaps to trap the heat, allowing them to travel through the landscape without freezing their bones. This ingenuity speaks volumes about their intrinsic connection to the natural world and their ability to utilise the resources to hand. Yet as the climate changed and food supplies became more uncertain, they just couldn't adapt fast enough to the shifting world around them. And this ability to adapt, including the adoption of new fibre technologies, is what potentially allowed modern humans to flourish in this changing glacial world, enabling us to spread out and inhabit almost every biome on our planet. String played a powerful role in taming the world to human will. I love this image of a piece of cloth from around 4200 BCE, dyed with indigo and crafted with spun chivo vine and the native coloured cotton from Peru. And string enabled the creation of snares, fishing lines, tethers, leashes, nets, handles and ties. It provided a way of securely binding hard materials together, like that tool we saw, enabling the construction of more complex tools. And it clothed us. While there may not be an era named after it, like the Bronze Age or the Iron Age, the spinning of thread and the invention of string rank among humanity's most pivotal advancements, on par with the creation of tools and the discovery of fire. Yet don't imagine these early fibres were solely a practical endeavour. In the foothills of the Caucasus Mountains in present-day Georgia, a region sharing the same frigid temperatures and relentless winds as much of ancient Europe, archaeologists uncovered some of the earliest known examples of processed wild flax, dating back to around 34,000 BCE. But these were more than utilitarian. The strands were black, grey, turquoise, even pink. There are multiple colourways suggesting both an aesthetic appreciation and a cultural expression. Beauty, as William Morris observed, isn't merely incidental to our lives. It is a positive necessity. For millennia, trees and plants served as the primary sources of our textiles, grounding us in a deep connection with the natural world. Of course, we made mistakes in the process. I've been amazed to discover how much deforestation has been a part of creating clothing from around 10,000 years ago right through to the present day. And I talk about this in my forthcoming book, The Nature of Fashion. But when we got it right, which was so many times, the results were simply glorious. Then came the Industrial Revolution, bringing dramatic changes in how we produce and use textiles. And while this innovation spurred progress, it also came at a heavy cost. The social impacts, such as child labour in the mills, slavery on cotton plantations, may be familiar, but the widespread environmental destruction in far distant lands is often less acknowledged. Brazil was named for the Brazilwood trees that grew there in abundance. 50 years, that's all it took for these giants of the Atlantic seaboard to be reduced to stumps. The tree is endangered to this day. The same happened with logwood in the Yucatan. When the Spanish arrived on Yucatan's coast, this small tree grew so abundantly that they used it as ballast, or they did until they realised it yielded an important blue dye, a rival to woad and costly indigo. Of course, the Maya had dyed with logwood for thousands of years, and they'd also used it to colour the plaster for their buildings, or to make the plaster for their buildings, and they'd long since learnt the dangers of chopping down too many trees. Some of the early Mayan cities collapsed, their inhabitants migrating in search of lost vegetation. Today, however, I'm pleased to say that most logwood is sustainably harvested. But this tension between what is visible and controlled and what escapes notice and is therefore ignored reflects a broader truth that power lies not always in what is seen, but often in what is overlooked. And one clear example of this is the persistence and prevalence of natural fibres in aquatic systems today, something I'll be touching on later in this lecture. hidden impacts and power disparities remain deeply entrenched in the fashion industry. And while I won't delve into the myriad environmental impacts of fashion across the value chain, there simply wouldn't be enough time to talk about the solutions. I think it's really important to start with an overview. And one of the most stark and striking examples of fashion's failings came on the 24th of April 2013, when the Rana Plaza factory collapsed in Bangladesh. And I watched the campaigners searching through the rubble to look for labels to try to prove which brands were producing there. I hadn't really thought about creating any kind of a response. And about 3 days after the disaster, I was having a bath, and the idea for Fashion Revolution just popped into my head, really as quite a fully formed idea. And it felt like a good enough idea to get out of my bath and do something about it, which I did. So this realisation led me to establishing Fashion Revolution, and we became well known for our hashtag, Who Made My Clothes? And in 2016, we published the first Fashion Transparency Index. It's now in its 7th or 8th edition, I believe. And this revealed how much fashion brands and retailers disclosed about the social and environmental policies, practices, and impacts. And at the time of our first index, only 12.5% of brands disclosed their first-tier factories. Now, that's where our clothes are cut and sewn together. Only a handful revealed anywhere the fibres were processed, and no brand revealed any of the raw material suppliers. Now, over half of the brands are publishing their first-tier suppliers. A third are publishing their processing suppliers, and around 12% are publishing selected raw material suppliers. And brands and retailers told us how the Fashion Transparency Index really played a crucial role in encouraging them to disclose and pushing them towards transparency. But some of the most severe and exploitative working conditions and the worst environmental damage happen deep within fashion supply chains, where fibres are grown and processed. So knowing where these fibres come from is really crucial. And raw material extraction and processing alone can account for between 40 to 60% of a fashion brand's carbon emissions. I've even seen higher statistics than this. And it's not only fibres. When I visited a brand new tannery district in Savar, Bangladesh, they moved it because they'd effectively poisoned the river in the previous location. I was told that less than 10% of tanneries and footwear factories have adequate working conditions. Young workers, as you can see here, were everywhere. Health and safety issues evident. And the effluent was flowing straight out through the drainage ditches into the river, which was home to a red-listed species of river dolphin. And I was told that no brand ever visited these tanneries. Today, although we still use plant fibres, synthetics have taken over in a massive way. Estimates vary, but synthetics are said to be present in around 2/3 of the textiles we produce, which means the fashion industry is highly dependent on continued fossil fuel extraction. And while brands may set up recycling initiatives and pledge to use better fibres, when it comes to the crunch, they still want to make more and more clothes more and more cheaply. These clothes are not only cheap to make and buy, but they lack emotional durability as well. And we can see the results of this in really visible ways in the mountains of clothing piled up in the Atacama Desert, or in the 15 million garments a week that are sent to Cantamanto market in Ghana, which was devastated by fire just a month ago. But what's harder to see are the billions of plastic microfibres that end up in our waterways, our oceans, and our bodies. As part of the Restoring Riverscapes project, the research team put 8 cotton polyester blend lab coats through one wash and dry cycle, producing 5 mil of microfibres. Now imagine that multiplied out by every wash, in every street, in every town. Laundering alone causes around 500,000 tonnes of plastic microfibres to be released into the ocean every year, accounting for some 35% of global microplastic load in the ocean. To help play my part in solving this problem, in early 2020, I joined the all-women crew of X Expedition and sailed 2,000 nautical miles from the Galapagos to Easter Island, the remotest inhabited island in the world, carrying out scientific research into the devastating impacts of plastics and toxics in the oceans. After we'd sailed about 1,700 miles, we entered the South Pacific Gyre. And you can see here that the water looked really calm, really clear, incredibly beautiful. We didn't see anything. We didn't even see a plastic bottle the whole way. Far from that sort of floating plastic soup that I was imagining. And we spent hours every day dropping our Niskin bottle and the manta trawl and analysing the results. And every trawl brought up an increasing amount of plastic. There was flecks of blue, orange, green, white. There was a black mesh. There was a translucent filament that coiled inside our sample bottles. And when I reached Easter Island, the beaches were full of plastic being washed in on every tide. I remember seeing shoes, Crocs being washed in. And one day I was standing in front of the Maui Heads, not these ones, but this was the only picture I had. And it was on a sandy beach at Anakina Beach. And I looked down at the sand beneath my feet, and it was multicoloured. And we can never clean up this heartbreaking mess that I saw out there, both on the beach and in the oceans. But we can and we must do something now to stop those plastics reaching the ocean in the first place. And considering the urgency of this issue, I would hope to see real action from the industry. In fact, last time I was here in Keele Hall, I was working with Deirdre and we convened a round table about fibre pollution, both from plastics and from natural fibres here, bringing industry policy makers together. Only a third of brands and retailers have any target for reducing the use of textiles made from virgin fossil fuels, and only 22% report what they are doing to minimise the impacts of fibre shed. And although synthetics have received significant attention in recent years, it's important not to overlook other materials. There's ever-growing demand for viscose, and leather, wool, rubber, and a lot of these involve deforestation. According to Canopy, over 300 million trees are felled every year to create semi-synthetic materials and fibres like rayon. And around a third of these, shockingly, come from old growth or endangered woodlands. Deforestation for clothing is rapidly rising. It was 150 million trees really not long ago, like 3, 4, 5 years ago. It's now 300 million trees a year. And this leads me on to my recent work with plant fibres and dyes, both the challenges and the solutions they offer, because there's a common assumption that fibres from plants are a more responsible choice if we ignore all of the chemicals and the deforestation and everything else I've talked about. Cotton makes up around a quarter of global fibre production, and at least it was presumed to biodegrade readily. I still see this so often on my Instagram feed. Oh, well, these fibres, they're all biodegradable. They disappear in weeks, if not maybe a month. And for most of human history, that was very likely the case. But today's reality is far more complex. So 2 years after my sailing trip, I was once again back on water, but this time I was on Rudyard Lake in Staffordshire, where I live, as part of the Restoring Riverscapes project supported by Keele. Looking at how historic textile production affects local water ecosystems today. And following my research in the Pacific, I expected to find mainly synthetic fibres. How wrong I was. When I started looking down the microscope, the first fibre looked like it had come straight out of a pair of jeans. And Tom, who was working with us from Loughborough University, told me that sediment at the bottom of a lake acts a bit like a time machine, revealing the changes in fibres and pollutants over the years. And as the researchers from Keele and Loughborough and then Northumbria and Southampton, people were getting very excited about these fibres, started to analyse the samples, they discovered that natural fibres like cotton and wool predominated throughout the core. You can see here that cotton is the purple and wool is the green, and you can see them through almost every layer. The oldest fibres in our sediment date back to around 1880, and we're currently working on a paper to share these findings. And this led me to question why this reality is completely absent from the broader conversations around sustainable fashion, and why aren't these textiles breaking down as we might expect? Today, around 15,000 different chemicals and chemical treatments are used during the textile manufacturing process. Bleaching, dyeing, repellents, flame retardants, softeners, antimicrobials, and all of this chemical processing means that most so-called natural fibres do not simply disappear in the waterways and oceans. And some of these chemical processes, like regeneration to turn trees into viscose, actually alter the structure of the cell. And this means that there's really very little or nothing in nature that knows how to break these fibres down. Recent studies have shown natural fibres account for over 70%, sometimes up to 80% of the total fibres found in samples collected from freshwater, marine waters, animals and the atmosphere. And this very much echoes our findings at Rudyard Lake. Why didn't we know about this earlier? Well, because scientists thought that plastics were the problem, they've been dissolving anything natural, including natural fibres, in order to isolate and count the synthetic fibres. Achieving net zero by 2050 demands a 45% reduction in the fashion industry's emissions by 2030. And the growing demand for low-impact materials across all fibre types is already predicted to far exceed supply. And natural fibres shouldn't be disregarded, both in terms of the solutions they offer and as well as potentially being part of the problem, because we must fill these knowledge gaps to make sure our well-intentioned efforts to shift away from fossil fuels and reduce pollution don't inadvertently create new environmental issues. So with this in mind, I set out to investigate what the world could look like if our textiles protected and restored ecosystems instead of depleting them. If our colour nourished the earth and perhaps our bodies as well. Our skin is, after all, our biggest organ, a permeable film between the interior and exterior world. Could our journey towards greater wellness for us and for our planet be woven into the textiles that surround us? At the RHS Chelsea Flower Show in May 2022, I caught a glimpse of this vision, collaborating with garden designer Lottie de Lamaine and Kate Turnbull, who's a natural dyer. I'm currently working with her on a very exciting project at Kew Gardens as well. We helped to create a textile garden for Fashion Revolution, featuring solely the plants that could be used to make and to dye our clothes. And this garden invited visitors to reimagine the connection between what we grow and what we wear. All of these plants were native species or easily propagated in the UK. Many of them would be known as garden weeds. And Kate and her students grew the plant matter, and we spent wonderful hours together at her school in Oxford, dyeing vintage linen tablecloths to make the back panels for the garden. And when she'd finished, she realised she had just enough of the fabric left to turn them into some clothes for us. So Lottie's jumpsuit, the green one in the centre, was dyed with kutch, Kate's was dyed with cherry blossom, and mine was dyed with daffodils and dandelions. Unfortunately, during the preview at Chelsea Flower Show, a few drops of lemon juice from my oyster dropped onto my dress, and of course it took some of the colour out. So ever resourceful, I found some welds growing on the cliff in Devon, and I re-dyed my dress with weld from my garden. It's a beautiful golden hue. After leaving Fashion Revolution 2 years ago, I was really fortunate to be awarded a Churchill Fellowship. And my research took me to Peru, El Salvador, Guatemala and Mexico, where I interviewed artisans, visionaries, activists and plant pioneers, all engaged in the potential of plant fibres and dyes. And the report about my research is available online. It's free to download from the Churchill Fellowship's website. And ever experimental, rather than being a report, it actually takes the form of a dictionary of plant fibres and dyes, documenting nearly 100 of the fibre and dye plants I came across, along with some of the stories of the people I met. Some of those stories are also working their way into the book I'm writing as well. And what became clear during my journey is that every plant is part of a larger ecosystem, and every thread is part of a broader pattern, revealing how the choices we've made shape the landscapes and the economies around us today. And my travels weren't just about understanding how plants are transformed into textiles. They were about understanding how these threads can be part of weaving a new pattern for our material future. So here are just a few of the plants I came across on the way. This agave is not a clone, explained Dr. Lorenzo Teja of the Yucatan Scientific Research Center in Merida, cradling a laboratory-grown seedling. It's a container for genetic diversity. And within its plastic protection, this green shoot, no bigger than a finger, seemed quite unremarkable. But for Dr. Teja, this was no less than a revolution. 30% more leaves a year, a 25% increase in leaf length in the first 2 years, and a harvesting cycle that begins in 2 years instead of 4, means producers now get around twice as much fibre. But the laboratory's work goes beyond yield. They're also focusing on preserving genetic diversity. And while we may see this as a modern advancement, it's worth remembering that the early Maya manipulated corn's genetic makeup through selective breeding thousands of years ago, changing a grassy weed into an edible crop through hybridization. And on the coast of Peru, they did much the same with cotton as well, extending the staple fibre of the cotton so it was easier to spin. Natural rubber comes from the milky white sap of the rubber tree, Hevea brasiliensis. And although over 2,000 plant species contain latex sap, including lettuces and dandelions, this Hevea, a member of the spurge family, is the primary species used for commercial rubber production. But the clearing of forests for growing commercial rubber has led to widespread deforestation, not only in the Amazon, but also in countries like Indonesia, Thailand, Malaysia. But if it's tapped responsibly, rubber can be a sustainable source of income for smallholder families with significant climate benefits. Based in Lima, Caxacori Studio partners with 59 indigenous Awajún families in the Amazonas region of Peru. And the Awajún rubber tappers collect no more than 150 millilitres of latex at a time so as not to damage the trees, maintaining the ecosystem for wildlife and preserving traditional knowledge. Caxicori produce a range of biomaterials using fibres and waste from Peru's agricultural industries, like Uvatex, a resistant biotextile made from grape peel waste. And biomaterials made from organic waste, natural proteins or algae, challenge the fashion industry to reimagine its inputs, particularly animal-derived materials like leather. Solutions to the environmental challenges of fashion may lie in such advances, and they may equally lie in reviving materials and practices that have been used for hundreds of years, if not millennia. Los Nacimientos in El Salvador is one of just 2 certified organic indigo farms in the world. And it was set up to heal divided communities after El Salvador's long and brutal civil war. Jeans are the most commonly worn item of clothing around the world. And I couldn't help wondering whether the fibres I saw under the microscope at Rudyard Lake would still have been there if they'd been dyed with natural indigo rather than the synthetic version. Sabo or kapok trees are known as the custodians of the forest. They can live for hundreds of years and they positively thrive in dry years, producing around 50 kilos of fibre per tree. And with that changing climate, surely they could play an important role in the textiles of tomorrow. Kapok is popular for filling, insulation. It used to be used for life jackets. But can these fibres be spun? People say not. They're too short, too waxy. But try telling that to Doña Chela. She's a master artisan, and she spins these silken clouds into diaphanous thread. And they've also developed a small manual spinning machine, which they're also using to spin the fibres. It can be done. Andean alder once grew across the Sierra of Peru at heights of up to 3,200 metres, thriving near rivers and lakes. But as you can see from this picture, the slopes are now mostly barren. Alders have been chopped down, replaced by non-native species like eucalyptus and pines. But alders help to fix nitrogen in the soil through their deep root systems. They protect riverbanks and they prepare the ground for other species that would otherwise struggle to survive. It's the perfect native plant for reforestation projects. And there's evidence that the Incas actually planted it on their terraces for this purpose. The bark of the Andean alder produces a strong red dye, but using the bark will eventually kill the tree over time. Most people use the cones and the young leaves, which produce a range of colours from yellows through to greens. Now, I'd hazard a guess that most of you think cotton only grows in white, but Peru's native cotton spans a spectrum far beyond this commercially desirable shade. I saw oranges, chestnut browns, greens, lilacs and pinks, and a university researcher even showed me a photograph of blue cotton growing in the Amazon. Nobody seems to know where it is, but I volunteered to join any research trips to try and find it. Vabi Miguel Toribio is another woman in search of a colour lost to all but the memories of the ancients. And she's part of the Yanesha community in the rainforest of Peru. And their dye palette mirrors the rainforest itself. Purples, browns, yellows, oranges from plants like yetznor, mango, matico and payon, a tall evergreen tree they call the mother of dye plants. And even though payon yields a really inky hue when it's mixed with masato, which is a paste derived from fermented bitter cassava, Vabi sensed an absence. And she visited the elders, and they confirmed that black cotton once grew across these hillsides. Some even recalled spinning its threads. Now those plants seem to be gone, so it seems, but Vabi refuses to let invisibility stand in her way. Black cotton must exist somewhere, she told me. One day I'll find it. And as I heard these rumours of blue and black cotton, I started to imagine a time when we didn't even need to dye our jeans. And just as colours exist within a spectrum and rainbows are contained within their arc, all over the world, local and indigenous communities who work with plant fibres and dyes understand the importance of living within the limits, of a beginning and of an end in which creativity can thrive. They knew that the abundance surrounding them is a gift, is not to be taken for granted or exhausted. Each plant is harvested with care, with permission to maintain the balance that allows all life to thrive. These fibres and dyes aren't simply resources or materials, they are conduits. They're binding us to the plant world and to each other. And they're an invitation as well to look deeper, to uncover connections that may not be immediately visible. I'm often asked whether I'm optimistic about the future of fashion. Fashion thrives on change, and I really believe that it can change, but there's still a great deal of work to do. Change has always been at the heart of my journey, and it is, after all, the essence of the brand I started back in 1992, Pachacuti. It means world upside down, the turning around of time, starting over again with a blank page of possibility. Achieving this transformation will require innovation, new materials, technologies, and systems. But it also calls for something deeper, a restoration of our connection to the earth, reclaiming ancient wisdoms and weaving a future that respects the planet rather than working against it. And more than this, it will demand a new mindset, a new era interwoven with respect for culture, craftsmanship, and the people and places that surround us, near and far. These threads we wear hold within them the potential to transform not only our landscapes, but also how we see ourselves and our place in the world. They are an invitation to trace, to weave, to create, to rethink how we can transform fashion from a contributor to global challenges into a force for global solutions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carrie. So we now have an opportunity for questions, and we have 2 assistants with roving microphones, and we'll also be able to take some questions from our online audience. So is there a question out there? Raphael, right there. Thank you.
I was surprised with the lifetime of cotton in the nature, but how would you balance the message? Because I would still think cotton is much better than synthetic material. What is your opinion? Are there big differences, or are they too similar?
I think at the moment we just don't have all the evidence. I mean, we clearly need to stop using fossil fuels to make our clothes, but we really need to build the full picture, and there just hasn't been enough research investment. It's only very recently that we've started to discover these so-called natural fibres in the waterways. And it was interesting that forensic scientists have known since the 70s that these natural fibres aren't breaking down. But it hasn't really, that knowledge hasn't transferred across disciplines. So yes, I mean, I tend to go for natural fibres. I love wearing wool, and you can get some really fine wools and cottons. But you choose organic cotton and look at the dyes, and I mean, there's so much that it's so complex and so interwoven. I think it's difficult to say that at the moment that natural fibres are intrinsically better. I think until we start to build the full picture.
Yes, please.
Yes, that first question was at the back of my thinking. When you were saying right at the end there about those blue fibres at the bottom of Rudyard Lake, had they been dyed with indigo, perhaps they would have degraded better. That gives me two thoughts. One is that the natural fibres in the first place are biodegradable. The polymers obviously aren't. So we need perhaps to look more to natural fibres because they're biodegradable, but they still have to be dyed with synthetic dyes unless we use natural source dyes. You then come on to the question of what is going to be then the cost of the environment of trying to grow enough cotton and enough plants to dye those, the cotton to supply the fashion market. I don't know how accurate it was, but earlier I did look very briefly at the amount of land that is used to produce cotton, the amount of land that would therefore need to be used to produce the plants to produce the dyes for cotton. And it suggested that for every hectare of cotton that is grown, you'd need to grow 15 hectares of plants to provide the dyes to dye them. My assumption from all this is that what is needed is a significant reduction in the need for fashion, the changes for fashion, and I do hope that those changes will bring that about, because just saying we should go natural isn't enough.
Yeah, absolutely. We need a reduction in the clothing that we purchase and how often we wash it as well. And I'm certainly not advocating for all of our clothes to be naturally dyed. I mean, as you said, that would be an environmental disaster as well. But there's some, really exciting innovations out there which are looking at new ways of binding the dye, because it's about the chemical dyes, but it's also about the dye process as well, the length of time that the fibres are dyed for. I think there's a lot of different elements that impact the fibres as well. And I've just been working on judging the Earthshot Prize as well, and I know that there's a lot of really exciting innovations out there, and I was really pleased to see how many of them were actually looking at sort of different ways of binding dyes to the fibre as well, which of course reduces water usage as well, another significant impact.
Hi, I'm just curious because one of the evolutions in industry for fibres was the fact that we were mixing fibres to increase their longevity, and obviously you've done a lot of research. Have you come across anything natural that increases that longevity that could be used as a substitution for the mixture of natural and synthetic fibres that we use today?
That increases the longevity of the...
The denim structure that we do because it makes it more hard wearing.
Right.
Thanks.
Yes, no, but I have been looking. I mean, certainly looking into cotton. Looking at in Peru thousands of years ago, they were trying to make their cotton fibres longer and more durable as well. And the native cotton in the colours, it's very resistant to pests as well, and so it doesn't need all of the pesticides, insecticides. I mean, I understand cotton is one of the most heavily sprayed crops in the world, and native colour cotton was actually banned in Peru for many decades, and they thought it would first of all they thought, I think, that the seeds would cross-contaminate the pure white variety, and they were worried about it not being sprayed and that the pests would jump over. And then eventually this wonderful woman called Yolanda I visited, she'd planted native colour cotton in the middle of a field, and then she planted the white cotton around it, the type that was permissible. And eventually they got so tired of waiting for the ban to be reversed, she called the government to come and see, look at this crop, I've had them planted next to each other for 7 years. Nothing has crossed over. And so I think, again, native colour cotton has a short staple length, the researchers are working under difficult conditions, because again, they have no funding to try and increase the staple fibre length. But I do think things like coloured cotton, if we can make it longer, make it more durable, they're looking at crossing it with some of the organic cotton as well. It really holds a lot of potential.
Okay, Steve and Fibre, I believe you have an online question.
Do you want me to answer it? Yeah, right, okay. We've got two questions, if I may, Carrie, and thank you for that fascinating lecture. First question is from Jennifer. She asks, are fugitive dyes better for the environment as they fade naturally? And the second question, a little bit longer question, this is from Natalie. Not a fashion-related question, but there is so much clinical waste in healthcare from a local and global perspective, particularly when it comes down to single-use personal protective equipment. What would your advice be on where to start regarding an alternative, biodegradable and sustainable alternative to plastic aprons and gloves?
Very good questions. In terms of the fugitive dyes, no, I wouldn't really recommend fugitive dyes. I mean, people want colour. People love colour in their clothing, and you don't want something which is just going to fade. I mean, that's part of the problem with the early logwood that came over here, and everyone was like, great logwood, but they imported the dye stuff and they didn't import the know-how, so all of the logwood dye faded, which made the woad growers very happy because they were none too happy at the competition. But yes, no, we want our dyes to be colour fast. That's really important, because otherwise, as the gentleman said, there is an impact of harvesting these plants, and you don't want to be going out and re-dyeing your clothing all the time. In terms of the personal protective equipment, my understanding is that a really amazing fibre for use in hospitals would be hemp. I've certainly talked to people who said if all of our aprons and uniforms and bed sheets were made from hemp, it would stop all of these super bugs. It's naturally antimicrobial and naturally antibacterial. And there's certainly some advocates for replacing a lot of cotton and synthetics in hospital environments with hemp.
All right, do we have another question?
Hello, thank you for your talk. I was just wondering, it feels at the moment that there are a lot of fast fashion companies where people can get pretty cheap clothing, especially students, in bulk. For people who maybe can't afford the clothing that's handmade and beautifully made with these natural dyes, would you have any smaller action steps that you can take if you can't afford these clothes to still be a bit more sustainable in how you buy your clothing?
Yeah, really, really good question, because I know that everybody, especially students and people on tight budgets, can't afford to invest in artisan-made and individual pieces. And I do think if you do buy something really beautiful, you do keep it longer and care for it. So I think it's worth looking at cost per wear. But I think also now, we've got some amazing second-hand platforms. I mean, it's so different from just, going into second-hand and vintage shops. You've got amazing platforms like Vinted and eBay, and I think there's so much potential for buying. And certainly in terms of microfibres, the first wash is the greatest when it comes to fibre shedding. So if you're buying something which has been pre-washed, you're already reducing, you're not going to be shedding as many fibres. And also, all of us wash our clothes too often anyway. I mean, we really don't need to be washing our clothes that much. So try to just wash your clothes less, wash them on lower temperatures, short cycles. And I think that's a really good way to sort of act more responsibly with all of the clothing we've got. Because really, a lot of our clothes, it doesn't... I think even with jeans, I think it was the CEO of Levi said jeans should be washed once a year.
Okay, do we have any more questions? One there.
Hello. Within your fellowship research and your business, what was your personal practice to ensure Indigenous peoples did not feel their knowledge was exploited for the gain of a British English language fellowship and business? And what would you suggest from your experience to others to build more equal relationships with Indigenous peoples when conducting research or collaborating?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. And it took me quite a long time before conducting my research to look into all of the legislation and recommended practices, because certain places like Peru, there's actually a lot of legislation around what you can divulge in terms of natural resources. And I think if I'd written things down and printed them and somebody else hadn't written about them, that there was something about I could actually own the copyright, which was the last thing I wanted. And there was certainly one plant I could not find anywhere, and they gave me the spelling. I looked for it, I could not find that plant, and so that wasn't something that I included. And I contacted the people in advance. I had people on the ground who were going out to the Indigenous communities. So some of the communities in the Amazon, they actually went out to them twice to check, to make sure they knew, so that they had their free, prior and informed consent well in advance of my visit. And we did still have one group I went to who, despite having their consent, months in advance, the chief of the group was away and they didn't know anything about it. And they were like, well, no, we're going to have to wait for another community meeting to authorise this. So I didn't interview them. But I think, very much this was about how... the idea of writing this down, most of the Indigenous people I worked with were really grateful, because they said, actually, we haven't got this, and this is a really important resource for us to have this within our community as well. So they had a lot of the knowledge in their heads, but they didn't always have the sort of the recipes. So I think they found it really helpful in terms of documenting it, and then me be able to share that back to them as well. But it's really tricky. It's very difficult in terms of sort of working with the Indigenous peoples. And all I wanted was it to be a respectful process, and to make sure that they felt like they were being listened to and heard, and they felt like they were getting what they needed in return out of the relationship as well. So I didn't explain that very well, but it's and I'm still very much in touch with a lot of those communities. So we're messaging, and I'm hoping to incorporate some of the stories into my book as well. So again, I'm liaising with them over that and their permissions.
And you were collaborating with Indigenous local national academic systems.
Yes, yeah.
So you're not just their only point of contact.
Yeah.
I think it's really important that you were crediting these are the scientists working in situ, and they're working on those systems. Oh, sorry. Steve.
Going to hand over to Fibre for this one.
Awesome.
Thank you for your talk. Okay, so we got a question here from Dave. He says, as a British consumer, are we better to focus on buying and wearing domestic fibers, whether plant or animal, over importing fibers from Asia or the Americas?
Oh, good question. There's actually some really exciting initiatives happening here in the UK around things like British wool, because, so much of our wool and our fleeces are just burnt, and the farmers aren't even getting, they can't even cover the cost of shearing their sheep. So there's certainly a real revival around wool. There's also sort of fibre sheds. So in different parts of the UK, there's something called Fibre Shed, which is looking at local systems. So often growing flax is really popular, and even in Leek, there's people growing flax and dyeing and spinning it. They're sometimes combining flax with wool. So a lot happening in the UK. Actually, it's really exciting, from natural dyes to natural fibres. I think there's a lot of potential. In terms of the carbon impact, I mean, again, we can't always say that what is made closer has a lower carbon impact necessarily. You've got to look at the whole picture and the whole cycle. But I think it's really encouraging that these are happening, but they're also community-based initiatives. And I think if you've been part of producing something, whether it's your own sheep, then you're spinning the wool, or you're growing the flax, or you're cultivating the woad. I mean, we've just done a community dye project for Leek Textile Week, and around 20 different people in the local community grew indigo and woad, and they brought it into the school, and they'd had sort of ongoing tutorials with Elizabeth Frigi Culshaw leading up to the workshop. And then we had a full-day workshop, and they were dyeing with their own woad and indigo, which they'd grown. And I think that's really important, because you can see how something in your garden can then transform anything. You know, an old bed sheet. In fact, my bed sheets were dyed in the garden at Chelsea Flower Show. They were like, what are we going to put in our pools? And I'm like, I've got bed sheets. So, and I'd love to see more community dye projects as well, where we have a dye vat in a different colour in the community, you know, every week, every month, and it's like, okay, it's yellow today, you know, do you have an old jumpsuit or a t-shirt or a tablecloth, you know, that you want to come and dye yellow? And I think there's some really interesting ways in which we can create some more community-based gardens. Lots of natural dye gardens seem to be cropping up around the place, and in universities as well.
All right. Any further questions? Calling once, calling twice. All right. Let me thank Carrie and suggest we move next door for refreshments. So I have a bit of a spiel. I want to extend our sincere thanks to Carrie Summers for a fascinating talk. As you can tell, I am so privileged to work with her. It's amazing. I'd like to thank our student ambassadors and Steve Kilner and everyone else who's enabled the event to run so smoothly. That includes the AV team from Kiel Conferencing, and ILAS. And of course, thanks to you for your support and contributions to the Global Challenge lectures. And as always, some really wonderful questions. Just a reminder that our next Global Challenge lecture will be delivered by Professor Antonius Ragobonsi. He's our PVC with responsibility for global engagement, and he'll be talking about heading south, patterns in international student mobility with Kiel in the UK. So this is another hybrid event. It's on Monday, the 17th of March at 6 here in the Salvin Room, and also available online. You can find all the details to register on the ILS website. And if you'd like to follow up and meet Carrie one-to-one or in a small group, we can move into the University Common Room and pick up on those glasses of juice and wine that we didn't finish earlier. I'm sure Carrie is happy to continue to chat. Thank you all for coming.